Hello viewers, welcome to my YouTube channel. Get ready for heart-touching stories. Don't forget to subscribe and let's begin.
The house on Clover Ridge Lane had a red door. That was the first thing I ever noticed about it, even as a child. The way that door stood out against the white siding like a declaration, like the house itself was announcing something important to the world. My father had painted it red the summer I turned 6, balancing on a wooden ladder while my mother handed him brushes and I sat on the porch steps eating a popsicle watching him work. He was laughing about something. My mother was laughing too. I remember thinking that our house was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen, and that our family was the kind of family that laughed on Saturday afternoons while painting doors red. I was wrong about a lot of things when I was 6. My name is Daniel Hartwell, and I am the older of 2 children. My sister Renee is 4 years younger than me, which meant that by the time she was old enough to understand the dynamics of our family, those dynamics had already been set in stone, carved deep, the way water carves through rock, slowly, invisibly. And then all at once, catastrophically, growing up, I told myself the favoritism wasn't real. I was the sensitive one, I reasoned. I was reading too much into things. When Renee got the bigger bedroom after my grandmother's antique dresser was moved into mine, making mine suddenly too small, according to my mother, I told myself it made sense logistically. When Renee's college tuition was paid in full and I was handed a list of student loan options, I told myself it was because I had chosen an expensive out-of-state school. When Renee's name went on the car, the vacation, the down payment for her first apartment, I found explanations. I became very good at finding explanations. What I couldn't explain away was the house. My parents bought the house on Clover Ridge Lane in 1987, 2 years before I was born. It was a 4-bedroom colonial in a quiet suburb of Columbus, Ohio, the kind of house that accumulates a family's entire history in its walls. The notch marks on the kitchen doorframe where my father measured our heights every birthday. The basement where I built model trains for 3 straight winters. The backyard oak tree that still had a rusted hook in its bark from a tire swing that rotted away sometime in the 90s. That house was not just property. It was the physical manifestation of everything I understood my childhood to mean. When my parents retired in 2019, they announced they were moving to Sarasota, Florida. Selling the house, they said, downsizing. The Columbus winters had become too much for my mother's arthritis. This made sense, I understood it. I had already been living in my own apartment for 8 years by then, and I felt genuinely happy for them. Happy that they'd get warm winters and beach walks and the slower pace they'd earned. Then my mother called me on a Tuesday evening in March and told me that they had decided not to list the house publicly. "We're selling it to Renee," she said. "We want to keep it in the family." I sat with that for a moment. "That's great," I said, because I thought I meant it. She always loved that house. "We're giving her a significant discount," my mother continued. "Basically family pricing, still fine, still understandable. Appraisal came in at $340,000, my mother said. "We're letting her have it for $180,000. The silence on my end of the phone must have lasted a long time because my mother eventually said, "Daniel, are you there?" I was there, I was doing math. A $160,000 discount. Gift by any other name handed from parents to one child and not the other, not offered, not discussed, not explained, just decided. "Did you consider asking me?" I said. My voice was very calm. I was proud of how calm I sounded. "I've been thinking about buying property. I grew up in that house too." There was a pause. Then my mother said, in the gentle but immovable tone she had always used when conversations were being closed rather than continued, "Renee has the kids, Daniel. She needs the space. You're single. It just makes more sense." I was 30 years old. I was single by circumstance, not by choice, and I had a good job in software development that paid me well enough that I had been quietly saving for years. But none of that entered the conversation because the conversation was already over. It had been over before she called me. I was being informed, not consulted. I said goodnight. I hung up. I sat in my apartment and looked at the wall for a long time. Renee moved into the house on Clover Ridge Lane in June of 2019 with her husband, Marcus, and their 2 daughters, aged 3 and 5. I went to the housewarming. I brought a gift. I stood in the kitchen of the house where I had grown up and watched my sister show her friends around the rooms of my childhood, and I smiled and made conversation and drove home and felt something shift permanently inside me, some final counterweight tipping over. I want to be clear about something. I don't blame Renee. Not entirely, not cleanly. She accepted what was offered to her and I might have done the same. What settled in me that night wasn't hatred, it was clarity. A long, slow realization that the story I had been telling myself, that I was imagining things, that the scales were balanced, that my family loved us equally, was simply not true, and had never been true, and I had spent 30 years burning energy defending a fiction. I stopped visiting as often after that. My parents noticed. There were phone calls, gentle inquiries, at Christmas where my mother pulled me aside and asked if I was still upset about the house thing. I told her I wasn't upset, I was processing. There's a difference. I kept saving money. In 2021, Marcus lost his job. I heard this through my mother, who mentioned it in the way she mentioned most things involving Renee, with a heaviness that implied the whole family should be mobilizing. Marcus had been in sales, mid-level management, and the company he worked for restructured sharply during the economic turbulence of that period. He found freelance work, then part-time work, then another full-time role that paid significantly less than the previous one. Renee was working as a dental hygienist. They were managing, but only barely. The mortgage on the house, even the discounted mortgage, became difficult. I know this because my parents told me they were helping with payments, which meant money was moving from Florida to Columbus in ways that hadn't been planned for. By 2022, Renee and Marcus were talking apparently about whether they could afford to stay. I heard all of this secondhand. I never asked questions, I never offered advice. I simply listened and I kept saving, and I watched the situation with the quiet attention of someone who understood that the future was not yet written. In early 2023, Renee listed the house. She called me herself to tell me. Her voice on the phone was complicated, embarrassed. Defensive, sad. She told me they'd tried everything. She told me the house had been appraised again, now at $410,000, and that they needed the equity to pay off debts and start fresh in a smaller place. She said, "I know this is weird given everything." I told her I was sorry she was going through it. I meant that. Then I asked her if she'd be willing to talk to a buyer before she listed publicly. There was a long pause. "Are you serious?" she said. "Been saving," I told her. "I can make you a fair offer. Full market value. No family discount, no complications, just a real transaction." I hired a real estate attorney. I made an offer at appraised value, $410,000, and I put down 20% in cash. My years of careful saving, of living below my means, of watching my investments quietly accumulate while I waited without quite knowing what I was waiting for, had brought me to this moment. Renee and Marcus accepted the offer within 48 hours. I don't think they expected me to be serious, and then when they understood that I was, I think they felt a complicated relief. The debt resolved cleanly, the house going somewhere known rather than to strangers. My parents found out through Renee. My mother called me that evening. "I don't understand why you'd want it," she said. Her voice had an edge beneath the surface. "You're still single, Daniel. It's a 4-bedroom house." "I grew up there," I said simply. "So did Renee." I said. "She did." There was a pause in which I think my mother understood that we were not talking only about real estate. "You doing this to make a point?" she asked. I thought about that question carefully before I answered it. "I'm doing it because I love that house," I said. "I'm doing it because I can. I'm doing it because no one asked me if I wanted it 4 years ago, and now I'm asking myself, and the answer is yes." She didn't have a response to that. We said goodnight, we hung up. I took possession of the house on Clover Ridge Lane on a Thursday in April of 2023. I drove there alone. I parked in the driveway and sat in the car for a few minutes before going in. It was a cool morning, overcast, the neighborhood quiet in the way it always was on weekday mornings, trash cans at the curb, a dog barking somewhere distant, the oak tree in the backyard just beginning to bud. The door was still red. Renee had kept it red all those years. I don't know if she did it intentionally, as some kind of inherited habit, or if she simply never got around to changing it. Either way, standing at the threshold with the key in my hand and that red door in front of me, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not triumph, not vindication, something quieter and more complicated than either of those things. I felt like I was meeting an old version of myself, the 6-year-old on the porch steps, the teenager doing homework at the kitchen table, the young man who had packed his things and left for college, believing, without quite articulating it, that the house would always be there to come back to. That home was a permanent thing, not a privilege distributed unevenly. I went inside. I've lived in the house for 3 years now. I've repainted the living room and replaced the kitchen appliances. I had the oak tree assessed by an arborist. It's healthy, still solid, still standing. I found the notch marks on the kitchen doorframe when I was stripping the paint to redo the trim, and I stopped and looked at them for a long time. My height and Renee's height, documented in pencil, my father's handwriting labeling each one with a year. I left them there. I painted carefully around them. My relationship with my parents has been honest in a way it wasn't before. My mother and I have had several conversations, real ones, uncomfortable ones, about the choices that were made and the way they landed. She has not fully admitted that the favoritism was real, but she has said more than once that she understands why I felt hurt. For my mother, that is a significant thing. My father characteristically prefers not to discuss it, but he came to visit last Thanksgiving and sat at the kitchen table and looked around the room with an expression I couldn't entirely read, something between nostalgia and reckoning. "Renee and I are okay. Better than okay some days." She and Marcus stabilized financially after selling. They bought a smaller house 20 minutes away, and Marcus found work he's happier in. Her daughters are 7 and 9 now. They come over sometimes and play in the backyard under the oak tree, and I watch them from the kitchen window and feel something warm and slightly aching, the way you feel when two things are true simultaneously, when joy and grief live in the same moment without canceling each other out. People sometimes ask me what I was trying to prove, and I understand why they ask it. The story has an almost narrative tidiness to it: the wrong son, the discounted inheritance, the calculated reclamation. It sounds like a movie. It sounds like revenge, but here is the truth as plainly as I can put it. I was not trying to prove anything. I was trying to come home. For most of my adult life, I carried a quiet story about myself, that I was the one who didn't quite fit, the one who needed less, the one whose wants were somehow less legitimate than my sister's. That story shaped my choices in ways I am still discovering. The way I underasked in relationships, the way I made myself smaller in rooms where I had every right to take up space, the way I saved money quietly for years without quite letting myself name what I was saving for. What I was saving for was the right to choose myself, To look at the house where I grew up and say, I want this, I am allowed to want this. I have the means and the right and the history, and no one's assumptions about what I need get to override my own. The door is still red. I repainted it myself last spring, the same color, matched exactly, a small ceremony I performed alone on a Saturday morning with a brush and a ladder and no audience. I wasn't recreating my father's Saturday from 1995. I wasn't trying to. I was making my own. I stood back when I was done and looked at it for a long time. The house gleamed white in the spring light. The door blazed red against it, a declaration just like always, I was home.